A federal judge has issued an order that has sent shockwaves through both Manhattan and Washington, authorizing New York State officials to begin seizing and liquidating some of Donald Trump's most valuable real estate assets. Among the properties targeted are commercial portions of Trump Tower on Fifth Avenue, long considered the centerpiece of Trump's business identity. This is not a procedural warning or a temporary restriction. It is the formal initiation of asset confiscation to satisfy a massive civil fraud judgment. When a New York court moves from issuing judgments to authorizing the forced liquidation of properties owned by a former president, it represents extraordinarily rare and unprecedented territory in modern American legal history. Background of the judgment. The enforcement action stems from a civil fraud judgment issued nearly a year earlier, in which the court found that Trump and the Trump Organization had systematically inflated the value of real estate assets over many years. According to the ruling, asset values were exaggerated by more than $2 billion in order to secure favorable loan terms and insurance coverage, constituting a long-running pattern of financial misrepresentation. As a result, the court imposed a judgment exceeding $460 million. Under New York law, Trump was required either to pay the judgment or post an appeal bond in order to delay enforcement while pursuing an appeal. Despite being granted multiple extensions and accommodations, the court found that Trump failed to do either. Judicial findings and escalation. In its enforcement order, the court concluded that Trump's continued refusal to post the required bond or arrange payment did not reflect financial incapacity, but rather deliberate noncompliance. The judge cited Trump's public statements dismissing the judgment as illegitimate and vowing never to pay as evidence of bad faith and willful defiance of the court's authority. Court-appointed monitors had previously estimated Trump's liquid assets at well over $400 million, undermining claims that compliance was impossible. The court ultimately determined that voluntary compliance had been exhausted, leaving seizure and liquidation as the only remaining enforcement tools. Properties subject to seizure. The enforcement order specifically identified several high-value properties as priority targets, including commercial units within Trump Tower in Manhattan, a Wall Street office building, a golf course in Westchester County. Under the order, New York State authorities were authorized to take control of these assets and begin liquidation proceedings to satisfy the judgment and accumulating interest. Execution of the order. Following the court's authorization, the New York Attorney General's office moved swiftly. Notices were delivered to property managers, and commercial tenants were informed of the impending change in control. State officials appeared on site with court orders, formally assuming authority over designated portions of the properties. According to individuals familiar with the process, the unusually rapid pace reflected an expectation of resistance and an effort to prevent delays or asset shielding. Legal and political implications. Legal experts emphasize that this case does not involve extraordinary powers applied to a former president, but rather the routine enforcement mechanisms available to judgment creditors under New York law. When a defendant refuses to pay or secure a judgment, courts may authorize the seizure and sale of property, regardless of the defendant's status. What makes the case historic is not the legal process itself, but the identity of the defendant. Asset seizures involving former presidents are almost unheard of, giving the action immense symbolic weight. Politically, the enforcement has intensified polarization. Supporters of Trump characterize the action as politically motivated persecution, while critics argue that it demonstrates the legal system functioning as intended, applying the same rules to all individuals, regardless of power or position. Financial and reputational consequences. From a financial standpoint, forced liquidation poses significant risks. Properties sold under court supervision often fetch substantially less than market value, meaning Trump could lose assets worth far more than the judgment itself. Reputationally, the impact may be even more severe. Trump has spent decades cultivating an image built around Manhattan real estate dominance and business success. Losing control of Trump Tower, the symbolic heart of his brand, represents a profound blow that could affect future lending relationships, partnerships, and investor confidence. What comes next? Trump's legal team is expected to pursue emergency appeals and seek stays from higher courts. However, unless a court issues an explicit order halting enforcement, New York authorities have indicated they will continue liquidation proceedings. If the process continues uninterrupted, this case is likely to become a landmark precedent, not because of novel legal doctrine, but because it tests a foundational principle of the American legal system: whether court judgments apply equally to all defendants, including former presidents. At its core, the case raises a fundamental question with long-term constitutional implications. Are judicial orders binding on everyone? Or does political status create an exception to accountability under civil law, broader legal significance? Beyond the immediate consequences for Trump personally, the case carries broader implications for civil enforcement in the United States. Courts rely on compliance mechanisms, appeal bonds, payment plans, and ultimately asset seizure to ensure that judgments are not rendered meaningless. If a defendant can indefinitely delay enforcement simply by refusing to comply, the authority of the judiciary itself is weakened. Legal scholars note that the court's decision reflects concern not only about the underlying fraud findings, but about preserving the integrity of judicial process. The enforcement order emphasizes that judgments are not advisory opinions. They are binding legal determinations that carry enforceable consequences. Rejection of key defense arguments. Trump's legal team has argued publicly that the bond requirement is excessive and that bonding companies were unwilling to accept real estate as collateral. However, appellate courts previously rejected these arguments, finding that the bond amount was standard given the size of the judgment and that alternative compliance options were available. The court noted that Trump could have sold assets, secured private financing, or negotiated structured payment arrangements. His failure to pursue any of these options was cited as further evidence that the non-compliance was strategic rather than unavoidable. Additionally, the judge pointed to Trump's public statements emphasizing his wealth as fundamentally inconsistent with claims of financial incapacity. This contradiction played a central role in the court's conclusion that immediate enforcement was justified, potential expansion of seizures. While the initial enforcement action focuses on specific high-value properties, legal experts warn that additional assets could be targeted if liquidation proceeds fail to fully satisfy the judgment and accrued interest. Under New York law, judgment creditors may continue enforcement actions until the full amount owed is recovered. This raises the possibility that Trump's broader real estate portfolio could face increased scrutiny, particularly if emergency appeals are denied or delayed. Political ramifications. The enforcement action has also introduced new dynamics into the political arena. Opponents argue that the seizure undermines Trump's long-standing portrayal of himself as an elite dealmaker immune to conventional constraints. Supporters, by contrast, frame the action as confirmation of institutional bias and legal overreach. Regardless of political interpretation, analysts agree that the optics are significant. Images of state authorities assuming control over properties bearing Trump's name carry symbolic weight that extends well beyond the courtroom. Market and institutional reactions. Financial institutions are closely watching the outcome. Asset seizure tied to non-compliance, rather than insolvency, raises concerns among lenders about risk management, governance practices, and adherence to legal norms. Several analysts have suggested that the case could affect Trump's future access to credit, even if portions of the judgment are later overturned on appeal. Real estate professionals also note that forced sales introduce uncertainty into already sensitive markets, particularly when iconic properties are involved. The precedent question. Perhaps the most enduring impact of the case lies in the precedent it may set. While the legal principles involved are well established, their application to a former president is unprecedented. Courts rarely confront situations where political stature and civil enforcement collide so directly. If the enforcement proceeds without interruption, it may reinforce a core principle of American law. That status does not exempt individuals from compliance with judicial orders. If, however, the process is halted due to political or institutional pressure, it could raise difficult questions about unequal application of the law. Conclusion. At its core, this case is not only about a large financial judgment or prominent real estate assets. It is about the enforceability of court orders, the limits of defiance, and the practical meaning of equality before the law. Whether through compliance, settlement, or continued litigation, the outcome will likely shape legal and political discourse for years to come. What began as a civil fraud case has evolved into a defining test of judicial authority in the face of extraordinary power and prominence. If the process continues uninterrupted, this case is likely to become a landmark precedent, not because of novel legal doctrine, but because it tests a foundational principle of the American legal system: whether court judgments apply equally to all defendants, including former presidents. At its core, the case raises a fundamental question with long-term constitutional implications. Are judicial orders binding on everyone, or does political status create an exception to accountability under civil law?